I have been in Edinburgh for over 50 years. I wasn't born there. I'm not of any Scottish origins. I've spent my academic life doing research in South Asia, but my family has no real relationship with India in the past. So I'm a first generation learner when it comes to India. And I suppose the shift that was announced in the introduction from studying India in India to studying India in Edinburgh comes, as for many people, towards the end of a career when you know you're not going to go and do field work anymore and you can't be bothered to write another grant application. And you think, what can I do sitting in my hometown that is still of interest and where I still hopefully have something to contribute? So that's the shift that I made. And this book is the second in a series, perhaps the last, of books, edited collections, which address this question of what was the relationship of Scotland's capital city, Edinburgh, to the Indian subcontinent historically, and how can we think it in the future? And I pass on to my co-editor.
Thank you. And I'm very glad that we can be here tonight. And thank you for coming all. And hopefully we will have a good discussion after our brief introductions. Just in addition to what you have already heard about me, being a curator at a national institution, what does this really mean? My background was not necessarily originally linked to South Asia. I come from Germany, and at the time I worked at museums on Iran, with museums that had collections from Iran historically, and I worked more with the Iranian diaspora in Berlin. But coming to the UK, my role shifted and I had to take on some other areas of interest, and that became then South Asia. So I still continue with Iran, but I also have broadened my knowledge on South Asia. And one of the main drivers of my work is to understand what the historical collections do in the museum, how did they come there, and how can we reinterpret particularly the colonial collections that we have to link them to issues of the 21st century. So again, working with communities is a rather important part of my work. But let's go a little bit historical. So I want you to follow me into a different place at a different time. What you have here is a painting by the Scottish painter David Octavius Hill. And he gave it the title Edinburgh Old and New. At the time, photography had just arrived in Edinburgh, so it was the 1840s. And Hill had a companion in his endeavors to understand what photography could do for painting. So they went out and took pictures from different vantage points of Edinburgh. So what you have here is not a true depiction of the city from one particular point, but he combined different perspectives. So that might be the first hint to what we're going to do today. And in this painting, you have here the castle hill and the esplanade that sits, or the castle sits on an old volcano. And in the painting, he used it to divide the city into an old town. So part of the title that you have it here. Very narrow streets, dense housing, overhanging clouds of smoke. And he compared this old town with the new town, which is in bright sunlight, has very fashionable buildings. It's an open architecture, neoclassical buildings, that is the academy. And then you can look into the distance, that's the Firth of Forth, with the other side into the Highlands. So from a narrow angle to a wider one. So he did not only combine architectural elements of the city, but he also went around and with his companion Robert Adam to take photographs of figures and characters in the city, and brought them together here on this part of the castle. Amongst these figures is a South Asian figure. So Hill created a snapshot of the 1840s of who was around in the city, and he obviously thought that a South Asian or Indian man, whom he called in a drawing a Hindu mendicant, I think, yes, was important enough to stand as a representation of Edinburgh at the time. So this painting is a nice summary of what the book does. Brings together different perspectives, but it's just a snapshot of the 1840s. The book goes back not necessarily 100 years, so we start in the 1770s and we go a little bit more than 100 years into, from this painting out, seen into the future, the 1970s. And we do this by looking at the city through individuals, mainly individuals, and how they reflected on what India could mean to Scotland, to the city. And we have extracts from these original sources. So rather than us interpreting it, we wanted these voices to be heard and to be seen in the book. As a museum curator, I work primarily with physical objects. And material culture from South Asia has its presence in many parts of the museum. So here you have on the left-hand side, what's called the Grand Gallery. So that's the central part of the museum building, dating from the 1850s and built as a museum as it is. In this space here, over all the balcony areas for many decades, from the 1880s to the 1930s, a plaster cast of the Sanchi Gate was displayed, and it formed the entrance for visitors who would enter from the street through the Sanchi Gate into the building. I don't know how much people at the time would have understood about it, but they would have discussed it. It was published in newspapers and surely was a topic of conversation. A slightly smaller object is, don't know for where I'm here, is this model. And this is the part that I want to introduce briefly to you. It's a series of models that came to Edinburgh as a bequest in 1826. It was given by a woman, Margaret Tytler, who was from the east of Scotland, but spent some of her younger years in Edinburgh. The family went to India, and or she went out actually originally in 1812, lived there until 1822, died in Munger, but used the time that she was there in order to reflect on her environment, what she was seeing in India. She didn't do this necessarily only for her own amusement, but because she wanted to contribute to the progress of society back in the UK. So she often talks about England in the extracts that I'm reading from. So England stands for the UK, England and Scotland together. Sometimes she is specific. So as I have already alluded to, the models, these 80 odd models that she sent, were meant to introduce Indian methods, tools, and machinery that she watched and she observed in the crafts and manufacturers in Patna and in Tirhut for Scottish people to learn from for their own benefit, to implement certain methods in their own practice. I'm going to read you from her catalogue to the descriptions for two models. One is in relation to cotton, and she doesn't really only describe the models in many cases, but she gives you an insight into how she approached this and why she wanted to do it. So the chapter is called Margaret Tytler, Skilled Work and the Division of Labor in Bihar. In number 34, she says, in looking at cotton as it grows in the field and considering the different processes it goes through, one is struck with admiration at the ingenuity of mankind in turning it to so excellent an account. Is it not from India that the rest of the world has learned the manufacture of cotton? The plant grows in other countries, but I believe it was here that the use of it was discovered, and although English muslin may rival, yet they are imitations of the muslins of India. We are therefore indebted to the naked Hindu for having taught us to make our most comfortable, agreeable, and elegant clothing. And as Adam Smith says of the potato being the greatest benefit which Europe has derived from the discovery of America, so perhaps the knowledge of the use to which cotton may be applied is the greatest advantage that has resulted to England from India. In catalogue number 52, she gave observations to improve the skills back home. But number 52 is a representation on the scale of 3 inches to a foot of the carad, or lathe, of the professed turner. Along with this model, in proportion to it, are 3 chisels and a hammer. Patna is a famous place for children's toys, and little boxes turned on the carad, and this model is, sometimes it's really difficult. She doesn't use any full stops, commas, or anything else. So, and then I forget where I am. The little boxes turned on the carad, and this model is accompanied with 2 eggs in cups and a box for specimens. The box is striped to show specimens of different colors. The manner of coloring those articles is a very pretty art, and it particularly deserves attention as it is unknown in England. I have indeed sent an account of it to a friend in England with a facsimile of this model. It is called the art of lacquering. Lac is a small insect or animal substance found on the branches of certain trees. The first processes which it goes through, I have not yet had an opportunity of seeing, but they are well known. In the state in which it is called shellac, it is purchased by Jagannath, the celebrated Patna toyman, who showed me the whole of his part of the business. He first holds a piece of bamboo until it is heated over a charcoal fire. He then sticks some pieces of shellac upon this bamboo. When these are sufficiently heated, he sticks other pieces on the same upon them, and thus in continuation, until there is as much as he can conveniently manage. Having thus softened a quantity of shellac, he takes it from the bamboo and mixes the coloring ingredients with it by kneading them together. He works very hard at this with his hands and with his hammer, and when the colors are mixed with it, he draws out the lac into the form of a stick of sealing wax. The materials which Jagannath uses for coloring the lac are vermilion, Europe or Chinese, sulphuret, of arsenic, indigo, and lacquer. The last is the color which had previously been extracted from lac. There are specimens of 10 different colors communicated to it by means of those materials, and of an 11th, which is the natural appearance of the lac. I have not yet learned by what ingredients he renders it black, but shall inquire when I go to Patna. So these extracts are really important for the models, or not the extracts, but the whole catalogue that she wrote, because so many of objects in museum collections have actually no context. Often we don't know why they are there and how they were acquired. So for me, the book is a way to set the many objects that are in Edinburgh institutions into a wider context of a relationship of Edinburgh people with South Asia. Margaret Tytler's ideas didn't last very long. She was still very much influenced by her ideas. Her ideas were influenced by Edinburgh Enlightenment. But this was over in the 1830s, and her models were forgotten and reinterpreted, not any longer as something in relation to concepts like progress of society, but became then an example of showing how disadvantaged Indian society was and how behind. So I'm handing over at this point to Roger.
Before I move on, some of you will recognize the surname there, Tytler, Jagdish Tytler, who was a politician of a certain kind, shall we say. So the same family, the Tytlers, but of several different generations were linked in this way, and not a particularly strong Edinburgh connection, perhaps. That's a good thing in this case of Jagdish Tytler. Margaret Tytler embodied a positive side of the Scottish Enlightenment thought with respect to India. Respect to India. But there's a dark side to the Scottish Enlightenment being ideas about the place of human beings in the world, really, which were very well developed in ways in Edinburgh in particular, but also in Glasgow, where Adam Smith was based much of his life. But there's a dark side to the Scottish Enlightenment, and that is at the same time as developments around philosophy and economics and sociology that are seen still to be very valuable, there was a development of racial theories of race, which put nations, civilizations on a ranking scale into which, of course, the Europeans were placed at the top. So William Robertson, who was principal of the University of Edinburgh in the last 25 years approximately of the 18th century, he died in 1793, wrote a book about the relationship of India to classical writers, Greece and Rome. But it had an appendix to this book in which he writes essentially the first sociology of India based on his readings and also his conversations with his friends who had been in India and had come back. And he writes the appendix, which is roughly half the book, and provides at the end of that an explanation of why he was doing it. Why was he writing this book of history of India and of its society? And what he says there is that he was aware that Europeans had developed an opinion of their own preeminence wherever they had traveled, in Africa or America or Asia, and that they viewed and treated local populations as an inferior race of people. He was aware of the way in which race had already entered into how his compatriots and others thought about the rest of the world. For Robertson, however, Hindus, both as individuals and as members of society, had many attainments in arts and sciences, and that he felt that if he had been able through his book to improve the way in which Europeans who were beginning to colonize India understood the nature of the advances, in many ways, he said, ahead of Europe, that his work would have been worthwhile, that he would have made a contribution to international understanding that was valuable. What the next few chapters in our book show, unfortunately, is that his attitude, as we've already heard with respect to Margaret Tytler, didn't last very long. And an Edinburgh-educated man like James Mill basically wrote a most hostile and vehement dismissal of anything civilized that had come out of India. But what happened to how Indians were perceived when they arrived in Edinburgh in reasonable numbers, at least in the 1870s, the 1880s? And this is my particular interest of mine because I spent all this time in the university, and many of my PhD students, my best PhD students, were Indian. And so I wanted to choose from the book's many chapters extracts from 2 chapters that deal with the experiences of Indian students in the city. The first extract is from the autobiography of Prafulla Chandra Ray. Now, do I need to tell you who Prafulla Chandra Ray was? He's a chemist. He established Bengal Chemicals around the turn of the 19th century, and he studied in Edinburgh from 1882 to about 1888. And this is what he says about the city. This is how he understands the city, and then as we go on, he gives you an insight into how he was perceived, and as it were, how in the Edinburgh population perceived him. So, Edinburgh is a pretty city, and the atmosphere is free from mists or the thick, heavy fog which overhangs London. There being no industries here, as at Glasgow, the smoke nuisance is not so oppressive, nor is there such heavy vehicular traffic in the streets. Remember, this is before the internal combustion engine. We're talking about horse-drawn traffic. It's surrounded by picturesque scenes, and the sea, the Firth of Forth, is quite near. I took my lodgings near the Meadows in the centre of the city, and within a few minutes' walk of Arthur's Seat, one of the volcanic plugs in the city, which was my favourite resort during my holidays. And here we begin to get onto his relationships with the people. I was singularly fortunate in my landlady. She, with her husband and children, occupied the back of the flat, while the front rooms, with windows facing the quiet street, were reserved for lodgers. Like other Scotch landladies, she was scrupulously honest and never charged me a farthing extra, and her daughter used to darn the socks each time they returned from the laundry. Then she goes on and says a bit more about it. He goes on and says a bit more about Edinburgh, which has undergone rapid and material transformation. Although not a centre of commerce or industry, retired Anglo-Indians drawing fat pensions and merchants who have made their piles abroad choose to live here, describing, as we do in the book, the extent to which Edinburgh was a place to which people from the East India Company returned. He liked the climate. In the cold, salubrious climate of Edinburgh, one can work much harder than in our own without feeling exhausted. And after the day's work in the laboratory, I always used to take a long, brisk walk before returning to my lodgings. So how did he engage with Edinburgh society? I confess I did not mix much with society. I was intimate with a few chosen families, but somehow or other, I always got on much better with the elderly male members than with the young ladies. With the former, I could enter into conversation on various topics, but whenever in any party I was introduced to the latter, I became shy and nervous, and the conversational stock in trade, consisting of the condition of the weather, the climate, or some such thing, was soon exhausted, and I had to fumble around for a new subject. Some of my Indian friends, however, were experts in the art of mixing with the fair sex. I could never cultivate the art of catching the tone of any society in which chance might throw me. I was introduced also to some of the fashionable, the swell, or aristocratic people, and on rare occasions I made bold to even attend balls, dances. My Indian costume was very much in request. Once a Muslim friend, hailing from Upper India, took particular care to array me in his gorgeous robes and turban. Naturally, I was the observed of all observers. Very likely they took me for an Indian prince. I went through some such ordeals as I wanted to have a glimpse of fashionable life. So I hope that gives you a sense in which she was part of Edinburgh society, but also somewhat in a patronizing way as a figure of general interest. So that's Prafulla Chandra Roy. The other picture on the screen maybe needs a little explanation why have we put it on, but I think it will become clear if it's not already when I say that the next student-related chapter in the book is about the Edinburgh Indian Association, which was the student organisation founded when Ray was in Edinburgh in the 1880s. And it was, in fact, the first Indian student association in the UK. So Cambridge and Oxford and London can go and wait for their second and third places. The Indian Association, the Edinburgh Indian Association, arranged discussions, it arranged debates, it arranged social activities of various kinds. It had debates on the caste system or the future of women in India and the benefits of British colonial rule in India. And in the 1920s, so we're now 40 years on from when Ray was in the city, Edinburgh University hosted more students from the Empire than any other university in Great Britain. So that in general they already existed, and then in 1927, the Edinburgh Indian Association suddenly comes to life and is visible in the newspapers at the time and even beyond, as I'll tell you. Why? Because in May 1927, and I'm quoting here, it received letters from the managers of some of the Edinburgh public dance halls and also from one public restaurant, asking Indians not to approach their premises in future. These letters were insulting, not only to the Indian community in Edinburgh, but to the Indian nation and to all the coloured races in general. So we have a race bar, we have racial exclusion in the city, and this generates, as you might imagine, a considerable debate. In the Scotsman, the newspaper, the main daily newspaper of the city at the time, letters were published in support of the students and others that were in support of the ban. One correspondent said that he lived in India for several years and argued that any hotel keeper is certainly entitled to discourage the patronage of these gentlemen if the majority of his clients object to their presence. And that since Indians could not mingle with others outside their own caste members in India, native students, again a quote, should be confined to India for educational purposes. Other letters drew attention to the large number of Indian students and emphasized the need for friendly relationships with them. Why? Because if you weren't nice to the Indian students, they turned into Bolsheviks, basically. And others mentioned the contributions of India to Britain's struggle in the First World War. So the Edinburgh Indian Association wrote to Shapoorji Saklatwala, the first Asian MP who represented a London constituency, and Saklatwala raised the issue in the House of Commons, and there was a debate. And at the end of the first couple of speeches, the Edinburgh MP gave the opportunity to deny the existence of any racial problems in the city. And he does so in these words. I would like to point out, however, that Edinburgh has been, both as a city and especially as its university, cosmopolitan and has welcomed students and visitors from every part of the empire and from every part of the world. Note, we have the empire first and then the rest of the world. As regards the university, there is perfect academic and social equality between all races. The Edinburgh Indian Association is actively supported by some of the chief citizens of Edinburgh, who give lectures in their rooms and engage in social life with the members. The Indian Association of Edinburgh has recently given a number of dramatic entertainments, which have been largely attended by Edinburgh people and which were much applauded both by the Edinburgh press and public. The Indians of Edinburgh also run a cricket team, of course, which has regular fixtures with the most prominent cricket teams in Edinburgh, and there is no inequality of any kind in that connection. While, as I've said, this question forms part of a larger question, which we as an empire will need to go into at no distant date, independence, I think, I say that there is no city in the empire which shows a better feeling in regard to her fellow subjects of other races than does Edinburgh. So basically a denial of what has been already shown very much as existence of considerable racial prejudice. And in the book, we note in a footnote that this claim that there was no racial prejudice in the city was relatively rapidly shown to be false. A letter to the Scotsman by a local man trying to find a hotel room for a visiting Indian, a graduate of the university, to stay in. And he reported that none of the hotels he visited was prepared to admit an Indian guest. So I think these two chapters together give you some idea of the nuances, the ambivalences, the ambiguities of relationships within the city over this period, particularly in the interwar period. And the final point about this advertisement is that although some dance halls and restaurants wanted to keep out the Indians, in this case, if I get this right, they thought there was a competitive advantage. So they say no racial or class distinction. So you can go dancing there if you want to. That's all we're going to talk about as an introduction. And now
thank you, Roger and Frederic. There's a lot of ground that you cover in the book. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you all first, before we throw it open to the audience, is you've got these many people who you deal with, and you've tried to retain their stories and their narratives without commenting too much about it, so that the reader can make their own, can draw their own conclusions. I wanted to ask you, how did you go about choosing these people? Because I would imagine that when I looked at the book, there are so many exchanges between Edinburgh and India. You talk about there are soldiers, there are doctors, there are missionaries, there are captains, there are civil servants, and you've got a very small collection of that in this book. So how did you go about choosing these?
So that's a very good question. I suppose we have a number of principles at work. One was to try and cover the whole period in some way or another, so that once we started with William Robertson in 1791, then we wanted to move on into the 19th century. So the choice was partly dictated by, okay, we've got quite a lot from the 1820s, the 1830s. What are we going to do for the 1850s and the 1860s? So we had another principle which didn't manage to fulfill as much as we'd hoped, was that sense that women's voices tend not to be heard very strongly in talking about how the empire was understood. So we have material on memsahibs, we have material on ayahs increasingly. There are ways in which we can find something about a woman's view and women's views about the empire. So a couple of these, Margaret Tytler was there for good reason. She's very unusual, and so is Margaret Wilson, who was the wife of, was a missionary and a wife of a missionary in Bombay in the 1830s and 1840s. We wanted more women than we managed to find. And there are two fictional accounts of Indian women who marry Edinburgh students. And these, we were very keen to have those in the book. Unfortunately, for copyright reasons, we eventually had to leave them out. So there aren't as many women's voices in the book as we would have liked. That was a late decision to have to leave out the novels. And beyond that, it was really difficult. That's the only genuine answer I can give is that almost every time looking for more possible things to write about, too many options came when we had to, just almost not randomly, but say, well, this one's more interesting than the others, so let's stick with that one. Knowing that at the end of the day, we wanted to finish up, as we do, with oral history accounts of South Asians living in Edinburgh in the 1960s and the 1970s. So those were the bookends. And it was a matter of filling in the middle as according to a sort of plan about changing attitudes through time. So we had quite a lot of missionary attitudes in the middle of the 19th century, so we left them out later on, and so on and so forth. That's not really an answer, but it's the best I can do.
So the other thing that struck me while I was going through the book is that you have chosen people like Walter Scott or James Mill, who you alluded to, who had the most vitriolic, and I found it difficult to read, account of India, actually. But they were people who never came to India. So how do they find a place here? Is it a sort of a perception at a distance, or is their perception of India even valid when it comes through second-hand sources? Because I understand that Walter Scott actually delayed the writing of one of the books that you allude to in the thing because he didn't have a person who could provide him with enough information about what India was. And when you read Mill's account of India, that horrific account, you wonder what credence there is to anything that he's saying. So, yeah.
Well, the answer is probably related to the first question, how to make a selection that is somehow representative. So on one hand, as you said, we didn't want to interpret the voices, but of course nothing is without your own concept, and you influence, or your ideas inevitably influence what's then the end product. So having these voices in the book is not so much because we thought this was a credible account of India, but much more what influence had these people at the time on the discussions that went on in society. The Surgeon's Daughter or the Waverley novels by Scott were reprinted again and again and again, as was Mill's account. So even if it is hard for us reading these texts so many times to edit the book, I mean, it gets to the point when you can't actually bear it anymore. But he had an impact on it. It was used as the main reference account for teaching purposes. So that was one of the questions that we had. What influenced the conversations at the time, and how did the thinking shifted? And this is what we wanted, not what we wanted to show. It just came out in the end. So if you read the book from the beginning to the end, you can see where these notes of shifts were. And for me, this is one of the main things the book can do. If you read these accounts separately, you will never get this. You can't understand the shift that happened in society between the 1770s to the 1970s. So it's drawing these loose connections forwards and backwards between individual people. That's also why we wanted individual people, because history is often told through big events, but actually we are part of history. We shape it with what we read, what we write, how we encounter other people. So that's all what you can actually read in the book.
So the other thing which which I want to ask you about, was you see, correct me if I'm wrong, but do you see this as a project of decolonization, which is part of a wider project of decolonization of history and of museums and things like that? I wanted to ask you, is decolonization as a project something that is largely confined to academia and universities, or has it percolated into the general public?
We should never have allowed him to be the moderator. He asked such good questions. So yes, the city of Edinburgh, and so I think our interest has been stimulated and supported by our knowledge that there are similar activities of decolonization, whatever that means in a very general sense, going on within the city. So in about 2001, I think, the city council established a group to look at the legacies of slavery and colonialism in the city. And they reported about 3 years later, and since then an implementation group, of which I'm a member, is attempting to take the recommendations and do something about them. So some of these recommendations are about not renaming streets that were named in the memory of essentially slave drivers or colonial admirals and so on, but to find ways of giving an interpretation of them so that people can continue. There's the one that I always use is a street called Magdala Crescent. Magdala was at the scene of a horrific slaughter of, I think, Ethiopians in the 1880s or the 1890s. And what do we do about this? Do we just leave it and say, well, that's fine, that's how it was? Or do we say, somehow or other we need to reinterpret that and explain that this was part of the history of the city, rather than changing the name and then within 2 or 5 years it all gets forgotten. So there's a wider program of activities, artworks to go in the city that will commemorate slavery in one way or another. The attempt to develop friendship relationships with cities where Edinburgh was part of a colonial past. So while the schools are related, certainly the city's own schools, the history curriculum is part of the Scottish curriculum, but where possible, we're trying to get integrated research on how slavery and colonialism affected the city. So that students don't just learn, oh yes, this happened in Scotland, but can learn, oh yes, and that's why this street is called India Place, or this why Jamaica Street appears in the city. So there's an effort to change the way in which children learn history in the schools, to bring the learning and knowledge that the university has into the schools and into helping to reinterpret different buildings and to bring out buildings' colonial histories. So the new college where the Divinity School sits is a building that was funded in part from money raised in the American South from slave owners. And the Free Church of Scotland, which was the owner at the time, was campaigned against, there was a campaign against them doing this and saying the money should be sent back. This was money that came directly from the backs of slaves. The money didn't go back, and now that building is in the ownership of the university. You could go around that building and not know that its funding came in the way that it came. So to try and begin to change the public culture of the city around issues of slavery and colonialism through providing alternative accounts of how the city got its funding and how that money was used in the city for purposes which are regarded as perfectly okay, but we don't talk about where the money came from. It's about time we did. So, the simple answer is it's beyond the university. The more difficult thing is whether we'll actually manage to achieve what we're trying to achieve in this project. And I suppose what we've just got is a grant of £250,000 from national lottery funding to push this work forward. And okay, it sounds a lot of money, but it's not a lot for the things we're trying to achieve. And the good news is that when it was announced, there wasn't a big kickback from the public. So probably the timing was very good. I think it came out between Christmas and New Year and nobody was watching. But, so undoubtedly there is opposition within the city to what we're trying to do, but it's not so vocal and well organized yet that we're pushing against the stone wall.
A last question before I throw it open to the audience, because I am curious about this. I know it's not a part of your book, but we're looking at voices in Scotland and their perceptions of India. Do we have perceptions of Indians regarding Scotland or the Scottish, the people who came to India? And was that part of what you came across in your research? And is it important? I know towards the end, there are a lot more, right? The students who are there start talking about their perceptions of the city. But in the early years, or the first 100 years,
So just to clarify, Indians who were in the city and what? No.
Maybe even Indians in India. How did they perceive the Scottish influence? Do we have those narratives? Did you all come across any? Would it be important? I'm sorry, I'm throwing too many questions, but would it be important for the decolonization program to know how Indians felt about the colonizer?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, for any good dialogue, it's not just a two-way communication, but you also want to know what the other side thinks about you. The only who comes to mind is an Indian munshi who traveled in 1766 with Captain Archibald Swinton from Calcutta to Calais and then to England, and then they came up to Scotland together. And Itazamuddin then later published his travel experience in a book 20 years after he had returned to Bengal. And he talks about the conversations that Archibald Swinton and he had on travel. It was a while they were on the ship on sea, and that these conversations, they touched slavery because they had to sail around Africa, to complaints about how Itazamuddin was pressed, or he complained, that's why he left, and also that he was expected to teach. So William Jones, who set up the Asiatic Society in Bengal, Itazamuddin was one of his teachers. So he was seen just as a good source to teach the British Persian. And that's what they wanted, but they didn't accept him as an individual with his peculiarities and characteristics. So there was clearly friction between the two that came across, and he has his voice about Archibald Swinton and how he used him to gain status when they walked the streets of Edinburgh. But it was too early for us, so we didn't include this in this book, and maybe we should have done. I don't know. I mean, there were clear ideas when we wanted to start and when to end. That's why we also don't go up to the 21st century, because we felt that too many changes, including things like the back photograph, you can talk about this, have happened, and it needs it needs a separate study. So maybe also your topic needs a separate one.
I mean, what Friedrich is referring to is that there's a part of the central tourist area of the city where has been a bust of Patrick Geddes for a long time. Patrick Geddes was the first professor of sociology in Bombay University, along with many other things and the town planning and so on. He was a great friend of Rabindranath Tagore, and Rabindranath Tagore's bust has now been placed in the same garden, so the two old friends can look at each other across the garden and continue their conversation. So there are lots of ways in which we get some idea about how the Scots or Edinburgh were understood in India, but they become quite specific personal relationships. The one thing I would say, which I think is something which I've certainly benefited from, I think we benefit from, is the ability of Indians to think that the Scots and the English were different. So the English came along and they were the ones with the army, and they were the ones who built the railways perhaps in order to control India, and they were the ones who destroyed the cotton industry in Bengal and so on and that. And the Scots, oh no, they weren't. They were doctors, they were teachers, they were missionaries, they were the good guys. But of course that is a complete falsification, because the army had a preponderant, over-represented with Scots, and Scottish soldiers were the ones who basically did ethnic cleansing in the aftermath of the events of 1857 and 1858. So there's no way that we can claim to be on a higher moral plane, but whenever we want to get a bit, of support from people we're dealing with, we say, no, we're from Scotland.
You've chosen to cover a large swath of history. I mean, 200 years is a lot to cover. I remember at one point reading the Edinburgh Review, journal copies from the 19th century, and just being struck by how much the coverage there was of India in every issue. But my question is there anything particularly Scottish that's different from other British perceptions of India? For instance, among the Irish, there was a strong anti-colonial movement which identified with the Indian anti-colonial struggles. So, a lot of things that happened in Ireland 50 years earlier or 100 years earlier were then repeated in India. So was there a parallel history? You don't hear so much about anti-colonial Scottish writers or thinkers who were in conversation with Indian freedom fighters, for instance. Was there anything particularly Scottish?
Very good question, and you're absolutely right about the links between Irish and Indian nationalist movements and the way in which they were controlled, and there was a kind of learning by the state on how to control India by what they tried out in Ireland. It's all very unpleasant. The Scots were bought into the imperial project in a way that the Irish weren't, I think. So, there's a complex history of the relationship between Scottish feelings of being Scots, feelings of being British, feelings of participating in the empire for particular purposes, and for reasons which were different, but had to do with the Scots' failures in their rebellions against English rule in 1715 and 1745. So I won't go into the complications of that, but what specifically Scotland is your first question, what's specifically Scottish? And I think what's specifically Scottish comes particularly around religion. So the Presbyterian religion, Protestant religion, was the dominant religion in Scotland in a way that a kind of democratic, anti-bishop, anti-hierarchical religion, which also had a very strong move towards missionary activity, towards evangelizing. And so several of I think 2 or 3 of the chapters we put in the book really are from Protestant missionaries. And that was, they gained an awful lot of support in Scotland and continued into the 20th century. And that movement of muscular, if you like, in some senses, Christianity, and of the attempts to justify empire by saying that the only reason that you can justify ruling somewhere like India is in order to make it Christian and bring people from the edge of hell because they don't know Christianity. And certainly there is definite evidence that I have that the missionary activities were much more prominent in Scotland, had much greater proportionate support from the general population, and were much more involved, for example, in missionaries coming home on holiday, giving talks, explaining what they're doing, than in England. Not a radical disjunction, but noticeably more engagement through mission as a practice. I'm saying disproportionate. So financial support, for example, I mean, it is a particular example. The Anglo-Indian Evangelization Society mobilized north and south of the border. Scotland produced as much money for that as did England, with 1/10 of the population. So I'm not saying that was true across all activities, but certainly, they punched above their weight in the mission field.
I mean, it's not so much the historical perspective anymore, but the 21st century, which is also important to us. So Scottish government has a different approach to migration and to the involvement of migrants in society. So while we try to create a multicultural society, so that sets us a bit apart from England's approach to assimilate cultural differences, and I think it helps us in the way how we work as cultural institutions to embed this, or to embrace this multicultural society more and to give it a voice. And I think this is what also enables Edinburgh City to do this slavery and colonial history work. So it's a continuation of differences that comes from the nation state approach, which helps to make a difference, hopefully. We don't know how long it's going to last.
I have two questions, if I may. One is, when you look at, let's say, Bombay, Madras, and Bengal, those were the presidencies. So is there a difference in the perception of these people from these presidencies coming into Edinburgh or the UK at large? The perceptions of the local people in the UK towards these specific provinces, or were they all categorized as Indian or the Hindu, right? The other aspect is how like we are all taught that there were three major streams. Like there was the missionary, there were the Orientalists, and there were the utilitarians led by Mill, right? Did these streams actually converge, or is it on a continuum, or did they actually kind of ever converge, or basically were they opposed to each other like we're taught? And why did the Orientalists actually fail eventually?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question was about the perception of India as a whole versus the perception of the presidencies separately. I can't answer that question in any serious way. The reading of the sources that we've used and those we didn't use is that there was very little in the city level, very little differentiation in the picture of India that was presented. So, for example, in the 1820s, in Mill, but also in James Mill, but also in the phrenology writing that we've included, there was an understanding of the difference between the parts of India which had been ruled by the Mughals and those which had not. But I don't think this fed into a particular long-term perception. I think these were, yes, sometimes they would talk about Bengal or Punjab or whatever it might be, but essentially it was India that was described. The second question is a question in intellectual history of India. I'm not competent to answer that question. My work has always been on the social side of things and of how people behave. So that question about why did the Orientalists fail is quite a big one, and I wouldn't try and answer it. Just the one thing I would say is that the titlers are really quite important in that story because they were Orientalists in a sense. So Margaret's brothers were involved in the native medical institution in Calcutta, and one was John, I think, became the director, and he only hadn't become first director because he thought his elder brother would take the job. So the titlers were Orientalists in Bengal, and they were swept away by the reforms of 1834, and John lost his job, and Robert went off and did other things. So yes, they failed, but I can't answer why they failed in the long term. It's beyond my ken.
I want to, you all had mentioned in the beginning about how the Europeans considered themselves superior to the rest of the world. And their attitude of superiority or the ideology of superiority did not just stop at stopping the natives, as they called the rest of the world, from entering restaurants. It also enabled them to be very brutal. I mean, the horrific killings happened across the world, from Australia to Africa to India to South America. That is well known, well documented. I wonder whether those attitudes have changed in the 21st century, whether those same attitudes enable the Europeans, who are still dominating the world, to support certain horrific things that have been done, especially in the last year. And that is one thing. The entire, whether the Europeans still consider themselves very superior to the rest of the world, that is one part. And the other thing, with this sort of an attitude, whether it is decolonization that is happening, or rather, especially in the last 1 year, recolonization that is happening. Just a thought.
Well, just from a very personal perspective, I don't think that Europe has still this perception of being the leader or infallible and can actually take this role. I have the feeling more that it's the struggle to stay where they are. I mean, I'm not British, and I feel much more European, but I have been removed from the center of Europe now for more than a decade. So maybe my view is a little bit a nostalgic view, but I wouldn't think that it's still this attitude that we can bring civilization, or at least I believe we shouldn't do this. And voices are usually more diverse than just to subsume them under this label of civilizing mission, let's say that. I mean, you can look at collaborations that happen across academia or the cultural sector, which I would think are much more interested in an equal relationship. This is what we have to make sure when we apply for grants. I mean, it doesn't come by itself. It needs a lot of sometimes forced thinking because it is very ingrained in what individual people do. So I think if funding bodies basically have as a condition that you need partners in other countries, yes, you can shape it in a way that it's still not an equal partnership, but that really then comes down to you as an individual. But at least there is this element that you should think differently, and I think it has helped to shape our thinking. And over the last 5 years, from the background of the work that we do at the National Museum, I would think it has shifted externally. Internally, it's a rather difficult battle too. So as part of a department of world cultures, what comes more naturally to me as a way of thinking is not necessarily embedded in other departments of the museum. So you can see how difficult and embedded it actually is in existing structures. And I sometimes get rather impatient to see this and unwilling to explain why we should do things in a different way. But at least there is an openness then to listen if you can get yourself to do this kind of legwork and to explain it. So something that developed over 300 years is not very easy to change, and definitely not overnight, and it needs a lot of effort. And this is why we wanted this book, to make a tiny, tiny contribution to it, at least for a few people who think that it will help them to gain a different perspective. Well, I'm not a politician. I can't really comment on the bigger situation, and I don't want to. But I think what we show with the book is it comes down to the individuals, and you need to control yourself, what kind of language you use, how you actually think about it, how you reach out. One of the more concrete examples is, for example, we have moved away from doing a lot of community work and create sustained community work, so that it doesn't become this kind of tokenistic work, but that we want to build long-term relationships, which is really hard because we lose staff because of budget cuts and so on. So we need to rethink how we do this work and how we can make it sustainable. There have been a lot of changes, but you need to look very deeply, and from an outside perspective, and you see the bigger picture, it's depressing. But when you look more closely, I think there's still hope.
Thank you for such. Thank you very much for for me personally, a very stimulating discussion you have had. I'm a member of the Royal College of Physicians, took my membership exams. My first exposure to UK was actually in Edinburgh. And I just wanted to share my very personal experience with this gentleman asking the question about, has there been a change in perspectives? And I would say it was the single best experience I had when in January of 1985, I grew up in southern India, never seen snow in my life. I spent a couple of weeks in Edinburgh taking different exams, including the part one of my membership, and then later went back. But the experience I had was staying in a bed and breakfast on Princess Street, and the Royal College of Physicians have their digs in Princess Street, and at those days we had to put in coins for heating, and we had 30 pounds or something like that as a foreign currency allowed when we were traveling. And so we would go and sit in the Royal College library all day long to get the free heating and so on. But the lady who ran the bed and breakfast was so hospitable. It was almost like a United Nations. There were people coming to take exams from all over England and Scotland, and that was my first exposure not only to the Scots but also to Pakistanis. There were a lot of There was a Pakistani surgeon, and this lady was so good. She told us, I know you guys have strange eating habits, so I will allow you to use my kitchen, but only on one condition: you need to keep it spick and span. And then for the breakfast time, she would serve breakfast for all of us, and so we got to cook our dinners there. And she gave us space in her kitchen to store groceries and so on. And some of us who didn't know how to drive, she would drive us to pick us up from the station, drop us off. So it's a very personal thing. And at the same time, those were the days of the skinheads, and I faced a lot of racism in other ways. So I think you cannot generalize it, but from a very personal point of view, I got an exposure that was fantastic. And fortunately, the second time I went back, that that was not lost in any other way. So just wanted to share that very personal experience.
Hi. It's a very specific question. In the 1940s, during the World War II, it just came to my mind because you introduced Prafulla Chandra Roy from Bengal. And during the World War II, there was a infamous famine in India, the Bengal famine in 1943, which led to 3 to 4 casualties. Yeah, million casualties, sorry. So I just wanted to understand, considering this was a result of a lot of supplies being moved from Bengal to feed the European troops, which actually used as reserves at the end of it. What was the narrative, if there was even a narrative, back in Edinburgh, considering there may have been Indians there, or even, let's say, conscious stricken Brits who had seen this happen and were not okay with it going on. I just wanted to understand the narrative because it had a huge impact, still continues to have a huge impact back in Bangladesh now, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and West Bengal. So just want to understand what the narrative was, if there even was a narrative back then.
I mean, that's an excellent question again, and it's one I can't answer because I think there are two answers to this. One is we didn't actually go through the records of the newspapers at the time, but I suspect there was very little reporting about it. So what we have in the book, this is not an answer to your question, but I think is somewhat relevant. We have the accounts of a man called Victor Kiernan, who was a Marxist, who was in Lahore and in Bombay throughout the war. And to my memory, he doesn't mention the famine in any great detail. So he was in Lahore or in Bombay. I'm not sure that he knew much about, because of censorship and the restrictions on knowledge. I suspect that the Indian population knew a great deal more than was available in the newspapers in Britain. But I go back to the first part of my answer. We don't know. We haven't studied the newspaper reports, and nothing that I know of suggests that there was a particular Edinburgh or Scottish response to what was known. Sorry, that's not exactly a full answer.
Yeah, hi, Roger. Thanks, both of you. And thanks, Mario, also for your questions. So, in fact, I have several small questions. So, I was wondering if the difference between Ireland and Scotland vis-a-vis the empire was Scotland wealthy and because Ireland was very poor, right, and a sort of colonized land. So that's an aside. The other thing is your work, this book. I was wondering who. So Mario asked about academia. I was wondering if this book has received, been reviewed in the sort of the general papers, or is it an academic text? Is it going to? That's another one. Sorry. And then the third is about this traffic of west to east broadly, or let's say global north to global south, in terms of being the objects of study. Whatever, not objects of study, but still, where the South is studied by both people from the South and people from the North, global North. So I'm wondering if, to address this question of colonization, if there is now, or if that can be encouraged, that people from the global South, in this case, let's say from South Asia, study the UK through that and sort of become experts on UK society or on Scottish society, which we don't see very much of, right? Here we see the reverse, but we don't see much of that. So I don't know if, sort of generally lay of the land.
I could answer very quickly the question about reviews. The book has just been released, so it's very new, and this is also the South Asia edition, so it wouldn't be reviewed in the UK until published by Routledge, probably in a year's time, roughly. But we have some people lined up who might review it here. So hopefully we will do this.
Yes, I mean, it's quite embarrassing, really, that we have, well, I mean, it's not embarrassing. We're very pleased to have this as a South Asian edition, don't get me wrong, and this is a very good way of getting it published. But we are now psyched up, the fact that the book is out and we can talk about it, but we can talk about it in Britain, but and say, yes, where's the book? Well, in a year's time, you might get the chance to pay £130. This is a ridiculous 13,000 rupees for a copy of the book or for an e-version of the book. So it's very difficult to make it something which is part of more general discourse. But it will be, partly because of the work, the groups that I'm part of, it's going to feed into activities within Edinburgh as material that could be used in teaching at school level, not necessarily the book itself, but as a one step towards a teacher who can use it for purposes, and maybe for senior students actually to use it as primary resource material. Why is Scotland different from Ireland? So, like answers to several of these questions, it depends where you look for what purposes. So in the north of Ireland, they have Presbyterians, and those Presbyterians are essentially Scots. So there is internal colonialism within Ireland by the Scots and their descendants and some of the English against the Irish origin Catholics and so on. So it's a very complicated. There's a man called John Mackenzie who has argued for a four nations theory of discussion of imperialism, that it does have different implications in Scotland, in Wales, in Ireland, and in England. So you'd have to go and read his work to know the answer to that part of the question. Is that all? The third one was yes. So that's a very interesting question in a different way, because the people who are doing a lot of the work of decolonization within the UK are of Indian or African heritage. So, for example, the British Association for South Asian Studies is now run almost entirely by people called Misra or Banerjee or whatever it might be, and slavery studies are by Black British of one kind or another, which is not necessarily a good thing. So, I mean, it seems to me that the problems that have been generated through imperialism in the UK is something that the British need to deal with. And these are British people, obviously, but nonetheless, I feel there's a role for people of European extraction also to play a part in that process. But your question about whether we're encouraging South Asians to study Scotland, it's happening, but very slowly within the country. But there's no funding to bring people trained in India to come and take part in that work. Maybe there should be, but it certainly doesn't. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. True. through foreign eyes. No, I think that's an excellent and necessary thing, and we don't have it at the moment. The nearest we get is people of South Asian extraction, and they aren't necessarily interested in studying Scotland, as it were. They're studying other things.
I might add one more. So I was taking a cab from the hospital to the railway station, and the cabbie asked me, "Where are you going, Doc?" I said, "I'm going to Euston Station in London." And he said, "Be careful of them English." And he said, "You Indians have gotten your independence, we still haven't." So that explains.